Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Olga Joshi-Hansen. I'm Chief Program Officer here at Grantmakers for Education, and I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to join us for today's conversation. This is the first in a series that we are doing on the future of teaching. This is a moment when we all read the headlines and see lots of news about schools, about educator workforce, and coming out of COVID, it feels as though we have a moment for funders to really think about what the workforce of the 21st century needs and to invest in helping to make that happen. So I'm very pleased to bring you a panel today that will be moderated by Stephanie Banchero from the Joyce Foundation. I will hand it off to Stephanie, and please feel free to use the chat function over the course of the next 45 minutes to drop questions. We'll move from a facilitated conversation to Q&A. Thank you, Stephanie.
Great. Well, thank you, Olga. So first, thank you, everybody, for joining us. I know that there's a lot of funders that have been involved in this discussion for many years, whether on the policy side or on the programmatic side. I think most of us know that the teaching job is not necessarily set up for success the way we set up schools, the way we set up the job. It's a lot, not necessarily set up for success. So a lot of us have sort of funded efforts to reimagine what this space could look like. I think from my vantage point, what I've been a little bit chagrined about is that they haven't taken hold and scaled across the country yet. But there are a lot of wonderful efforts going on out there. We're going to hear about some of them today. Really looking forward to this conversation where we can focus on sort of the programmatic work, but also talk a little bit about the policy, the systems that are necessary to grow this kind of work. So we have a very esteemed panel today, very, very excited. These people are super busy, so happy that they could all join us. I'm just going to quickly introduce everybody, and then I'm going to turn it over to our first panelist. So Carol Basile is the Dean at Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. I think probably everybody knows who she is. So thank you, Carol, for joining us. Dr. Andy Forlis, she's a superintendent of Mesa Public Schools in Arizona. I am in Chicago looking out the window at very rainy days, so I'm jealous that you guys are in Arizona. We have Robin Kanan from Knowledge Works with us, Dr. Jack Smith, who again, I am sure a lot of people know. He is a former superintendent, and now he's leading the partnership work between ASU and the AASA. And then lastly, we have Michael Weinberg from the Thornburg Foundation. Great panel, lots to cover. Please feel free to drop your questions in the chat. I'll monitor the chat. I'm just going to start by just kicking it over to Carol and just talk about the work you guys are doing in Arizona right now around the reimagining the teacher workforce.
So, oh my gosh, if you read the paper, because obviously we have an issue with teachers and I think the sustainability of our public school systems. We certainly have been really over a long period of time now losing our teachers. This is not a new thing. It feels like it's a bit exponential at the moment, but it certainly isn't new. We've seen fewer teachers coming into this field. We see more leaving quickly. And we have, for I think a very long time, thought about this as a recruiting and retention problem. And we said about 4 years ago, pre-pandemic, that this is not a recruitment and retention problem, that this is actually the way we would define it. It's a workforce development or a workforce design problem. So here we sit as the largest education school. Just to give you a sense, we're about 7,700 students, about 350 full-time faculty and staff. We have been really thinking about what this means and what it means to really think about education as a workforce development problem, just like we would think about engineering, or we think about the tech field or the STEM fields, or nursing or any other profession, when we've thought about this a little differently. So we have now partnered with our largest district in our state, Mesa Public Schools, plus there's some other districts that are moving this direction with us, plus AASA, plus AACTE on the teacher ed side, to try and figure out how we begin to leverage what we do and lead the redesigning of the entire education workforce, and not only the redesign of the workforce, but also the structures the roles that teachers play, the way they work together, the way schools are structured, the way human development system, human resource systems are structured and thought about. So everything is really open for conversation. But the one major pivot point for us is really the abandonment of the one teacher, one classroom model. Because the minute that we start there, it is opening the doors for us to think about all kinds of things and all kinds of other ways that we could think about how teams of educators, distributing expertise, that we can no longer think about how every single teacher is going to be able to be all things to all kids all the time. So we have to start looking at their experience and their expertise and how we put them in the right kinds of teams, whether it's grade level teams or vertical teams. At the high school, it's integrated teams, it's departmentalized, departmental teams, but working in different ways than what we have seen before. How those teams then are able to then personalize and deepen learning, and how then we begin to think about how people enter the profession, how they advance, and how they specialize. So for many, many years, we've seen investments, right, that have been made in teacher residencies and programs and projects and lots of things, right, around how we diversify, how we recruit, how we retain more teachers. We're now seeing, right, everything now is about apprenticeships and how we're going to start thinking about what that looks like and what that means. But if we continue to do this, if we continue to think about programs and projects and activities in a one teacher, one classroom model, I believe we're going to continue to get what we have always gotten, because we have not fundamentally changed the structure in any substantive way in schools or in teacher preparation, right? That really is going to help us sustain our public schools, whether they be charters or traditional. So 4 years ago, I was at Mayo Clinic. I had the flu. I know many of you remember the flu. It was before COVID, but there I was in the emergency room, and there was a poster on the wall, and the poster had little boxes, and every little box had the image of a person in different colored scrubs. And depending on the color of the scrubs they were wearing, they were somebody different. They were a nurse, they were a doctor, they were a radiologist, they were all kinds of technicians, a team, right? That was being built around this group of diverse patients. And at the top of that poster, it said, "Who's in your room?" And I looked at that and I said to my husband, feeling really, really crummy, but I said to him, please take a picture of that, because that's the way we need to start thinking about what the workforce in education begins to look like. How do we begin thinking about who community educators are? How do we think about technicians? How do we start to amp up paras and teachers' aides and really take them from what I think are underprepared roles to much more prepared but technical roles? How do we think about professional teachers and the expertise that they bring to the table? How do we think about specializations? How do we think about what people look like as they work across multiple teams? And what do we look like? What does leadership look like, right? To manage really being a building systems leader, not just an instructional leader. So this is the direction that we're headed. We are redesigning the entire education workforce in a variety of ways and shapes to really think about not how we take a group of kids and say, here's your 25 kids, your 25 kids, and your 25 kids, or 30 kids, or across the world, it's 40 or 60 kids. But how do we actually look at a group of kids? How do we look at the context in which they are in, the needs that they have, and how do we build the right set of adults around them that can actually address the needs of those kids when they need it? So this is a shift. This is a fundamental mind shift as we think about how we redesign the workforce and how we redesign the structure of what schooling is.
That was fantastic. I want to see that picture that you took of the clinic. It strikes me as this is a perfect story for Atul Gawande to write in the New Yorker. He's a doctor, and he's written a lot about how we think about human capital systems and comparing the way they do things in medicine with other things. I feel like that's a perfect article for him. That was brilliant, and I love that it's not about recruitment or retention, but a workforce design problem. I think that's like a great statement to start from. So this kind of work only works, I think it's fair to say, if you have strong partnerships with school districts. Like, this is not something teacher prep does alone. You need strong partnerships. So maybe I'll turn to Andy and just talk a little bit about, first, before you begin, I'd love to know about the partnership between you guys, because I think that's so key to this, and then talk about why you embrace this idea.
And first, I'll start off by telling you a little bit about Mesa Public Schools. We're the largest school system in the state of Arizona, 60,000 students and 85 buildings. And we are, if not the largest employer, we go neck and neck with another one. We're either number one or number two. So we have a vested interest in how we educate our children, but also how we invest in those who are serving our children in multiple capacities. So we began our journey with the Mary Lou Fulton Teacher College at Arizona State University because we needed to answer this big question. What are we going to do about our future workforce? We were seeing that recruitment was very much a challenge, as is retention. And so we dug in and we asked some additional questions. What we quickly learned and continue to learn are that educators are not leaving the profession, they're leaving the working conditions. The working conditions become untenable when we are asking them to do so much with so little. We also have to remember that there is no state in America that spends less on educating children than Arizona. So we have very few dollars and we have to use them very wisely. So how is it that we are going to extend our resources, study the adults in the building, and figure out how can they best serve our children? And we know that a teaming model is a step in the right direction to making that happen. Our children are more complex than ever. Their needs are more complex than ever. And we do have a dynamic and changing workforce. Our newer teachers, they do not want to work in isolation. They want to work in teams. They want to share problems. They want to share solutions with one another. They want to think very creatively about how that they are truly meeting the needs of every child that walks through their doors. So we knew we needed a new model. We got started very slowly by talking about what might we do with what we formerly called student teachers. How would we look at student teachers differently? How would we look at our instructional assistants differently? How would we look at our master teachers differently? We really believe that keeping strong teachers in classrooms is important, and we have to build career pathways so that they stay in classrooms, so that they have a very, very close connection to our students. When we survey our families, we ask the question that comes up to the top, no matter what survey we do, what comes to the top is, what do you want most for your children? A caring adult. I would like to have that plural. I want families to have an expectation in Mesa Public Schools that there are caring adults surrounding their children every single day to ensure that they have the greatest success possible. So we know that we've got to change this formula. Schools were not built. If you think about the 1900s, schools were not built around relationships. They were not built to create thinkers. And so we have to disrupt this model. And we know that that's our only way that we are going to meet the needs of all of our children. So our approach is very much around meeting the needs of our children.
Andy, can you talk a little bit about the relationship that you may have already had, or maybe you didn't, I don't know, with Fulton Teachers College? And yeah, how important is that in all of this working?
Sure. So many of you that are on the call that are well adept to understanding K-12 systems. K-12 systems rely upon our university partners to supply us with the next generation of teachers and administrators and superintendents, quite honestly. So it's through that formalized higher education pathway that we've had this formal relationship. So that's been going for many years. We've also done a lot of collaboration around embedded master's degree programs within our system and Arizona State University, but it's all been on a very formalized system. It has not necessarily been at the granular level of thinking about individual classrooms, individual needs of students, and how do we partner around that. My experience, again, it's been around filling our pipeline of needed educators.
And Andy, just one last question for you. It sounds to me like that the teachers were already on board with this, and maybe I'm going to make a supposition. Well, I'm not going to make a supposition. Let me ask you: were the teachers on board and the principals on board? This is a fantastic idea. The vision you've just set out. Let's start it tomorrow. And if not, what needed to happen in order to get people to that place?
So, as I mentioned, we have 85 schools, and I have given a challenge to our district level team, as well as to our principals, that 50% of our schools are going to be working in the next education workforce model by 2023. So that was last year. So nothing like setting a goal, right? You set the goal and then you see who was already a believer, who was already doing some of this work organically and on their own and really embracing it. So we had about 3 schools that jumped on board right away and said, I don't need incentives. I don't need a goal. I just need to change what's happening in my school. So that is our test pilot. We are learning. And one of the things that we're continuing to learn is our current systems of public education. Many of them are getting in the way. So we have to kick down those barriers together. We were very fortunate in October, Arizona State University and Mesa Public Schools was awarded a teacher and school leader grant to help us do just that. Design the human capital systems needed for our teachers, our educators, and our students to realize the benefits of the next education workforce. So things like, how do we think about teaming? How do we put the systems in place? How do we provide the right incentive? How do we provide the right support that moves us away from the one teacher, one classroom? Now, it would be crazy for me to say that all 85 schools are raising their hand, jumping up and down and saying, let's go tomorrow. We are on the continuum of change, but success continues to breed success. So instead of us going out and knocking on doors, now successes of our schools that are fully embracing the model, they're receiving so much success. In fact, the most important data point is that their employees in their buildings report much higher levels of satisfaction and value add to their jobs. And that's what's making a difference, especially in the educational environment we're living in through COVID.
Great. Well, bravo to you for setting a very, very aggressive goal. I don't know if you set it during COVID, but good for you. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So a couple things I just want to put Andy and Carol in your minds. I'm going to turn to Jack, but 2 things I want to come back to as a panel are how to get teacher prep more involved in this. You're thinking about this differently, but I'll come back on that. And secondly, budget. Are these things budget neutral? And if not, what do districts do that are strapped for cash? I mean, we feel a little bit like, yay, it's a perfect time right now because there's federal money, but obviously at some point that runs out. So just thinking about the budget part of it and the role of teacher prep. But let me just turn to Jack. And just, Jack, can you talk a little bit about AASA's role or why you guys are interested in this and sort of your role in all of this?
Absolutely. It's nice to see you, Stephanie, and all of the panel members today. I think this is some of the most exciting work I've seen in my 41 years in education in this country. And the reason for that is we've known the problem that Andy and Carol just described, that we drop a teacher in a room, and if they make it through that first year, then they've survived. If they actually stay in the profession 5 years, it's unusual. I mean, anywhere from 2 to 5 out of every 10 leave the profession, depending on where you are, every within 5 years. That's an amazing statistic. So we've got to change that because we've known about this for a long time. AASA is the Superintendents Association. I've spent most of the last 20 years being a superintendent at the local and state level in Maryland. And we've looked at this and we've said, what are we going to do? So Maryland started about 10 years developing legislation that actually passed last April. It's called the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. The legislation calls for a design very, very similar to what Carol described. As I left Maryland this past summer because of some illness with a grandchild and had to leave my job, much to my regret, and moved to Maine, I was really worried about how are they going to make the blueprint a reality in Maryland, because we've got to build the infrastructure for it. We've got to build the systems for it in pre-K-12 and higher ed. And in July, I saw Carol's work as I was starting to do some work for AASA. And I said to the leaders at AASA, yes, I want to work on this. This will make a powerful difference in what happens, because you see these systems bubbling up all over the country right now. I talked to a little superintendent of a little or smaller system in Washington State. He's trying to do this on his own in central Washington. There are some people in South Carolina who are trying to do it. Talked to one of your members the other day, who is a grant maker, who was working on this in Colorado more than 10 years ago. What ASU has done and working with AASA is to begin to build systems and so it can become both scaled across, and I want to say these numbers because I think they're so powerful. There are almost 14,000 districts in this country. There are over 110,000 public schools, and there are over 50 million children being served in those. So while we have a lot of one-off kinds of efforts and a lot of redesign efforts in small schools and charter schools and contract schools, we've got to make this a reality for all students, because there is a future orientation to it. There is an equity focus in it, and there is a way to support the people who work in the school systems so they want to be there on behalf of children. And so AASA wants to work with ASU to build networks and systems through a cohort network system across the country, so that while ASU is bringing it to us and introducing it to us, it's got to be replicated over and over and over in pre-K-12 and in higher education. And obviously I could go on for hours about it, but it is one of the most exciting, I think, changes I've seen in my entire career. And I think it's going to happen, because we know about exponential change. It's under the surface for a long time. But as I was with a whole bunch of superintendents and a whole bunch of sessions last week at a national conference, it's bubbling everywhere. And I love that ASU has brought forth a model that's doable, it's implementable, and it can be grown, scaled, and sustained. So my hats off to Carol and Andy both, because they are leading the way in this effort, and we want to be right there with them to support them.
Jack, so don't mute yourself yet, because I got a couple questions.
Yes.
So I don't forget me to go back to the use of the word model, because I want to ask a little bit more, probe a little bit more on that. But Jack, you've been around for a while. That's not an insult. And I'm just curious, given your broad experience, why hasn't it taken off and scaled to 14,000 or 10 to 5,000? Like, what's been holding us back for large scale?
Well, frankly, I think one of the issues has been exactly what Carol says, and she's called it out in a way I've never heard it called out before. And that is that we take one teacher and put them in one room. And if we haven't been able to hire, 50 teachers that year in our system, then the newspaper reports in the first week that our metric for our evaluation on teachers is that we're 50 teachers short. And so that model has been so ingrained in us and it's been so stuck in our head. And we haven't changed the way the medical professions changed, the way engineering's changed, the way IT's changed, the way people who build cars have changed. We haven't changed those things. And I think with ASU, with Mesa, and with other places, other higher ed, other pre-K-12, calling out the idea that putting one adult who is committed and trained and ready to do the job in a room in isolation in 2022 is not working. And saying that plainly, I think has really gotten a lot of people's attention, because they've known it, but nobody's kind of ever come out and said it before this clearly and directly. And I think having the Superintendent's Association, for example, in Maryland, the NEA affiliate, the Maryland State Teachers Association, and the AFT affiliate in Baltimore City, both were highly engaged in writing that legislation that's supposed to drive this kind of change. So people are feeling it, they're seeing it, but they're looking for a model and a way forward, a set of systems that will actually completely change it. As I've heard Carol say, there were books written in the 60s, 70s, and 80s about teaming, but they didn't go nearly far enough to really have the effect that they need to have.
Well, you set me up for my last question for you, but before I ask the question, I said this on our prep call, but I'm going to say it again. Jack, you weren't there. If any of you remember the Jetsons, if you look at it, was popular in the 70s or 80s. If you looked at what they envisioned back then, they had flying cars, and we were talking to TVs, like things that we never would have imagined, electric cars that were flying around. But the school, and I think it was called the Little Dipper School, basically had one teacher standing in front of a classroom and all the kids sitting in a desk. Now, granted, it was a robot, but still, the vision of what school could look like into the future was basically what we have right now. Even they couldn't envision anything different.
Right.
Jack, you mentioned the AFT. So, Arizona is every state, every district is very contextualized. What can work in Arizona may be don't want to say can't work, but it would look different in, say, Chicago, for example. I'm curious about the role of the unions. What is the role of the unions, especially in places that have very strong unions, in being part of this? And what have you, it sounds like they've been accepted here, at least in Maryland. Can you just talk a little bit about what you've seen across the country?
Well, they're absolutely going to have to be engaged in it without any doubt, whether it's a right to work state or a heavily unionized state. And having worked in Washington state and in Maryland and been engaged in lots of other states, with Virginia right across from Maryland, and has been a right to work state, although they've made a few shifts in the past year. Seeing that, the key will be that everyone come together and say, what's going to support our educators in order to support our children? Because supporting the students is what will sustain and make public education work going forward. Otherwise, it's at real risk when we look at it. Public education is at real risk. And so I think that exponential change, unions are there for a very reasonable and thoughtful purpose, which is to advocate for staff members. And that's going to have to change. And in Maryland, very union heavy state, the association, state leadership and local leadership acknowledged that in the writing of the blueprint for Maryland's future legislation. They said, we're going to have to change the way we look at it because first-year teachers and 35-year teachers aren't the same. They don't have the same needs, the same experiences, the same expertise. And what results do people get? How can you say you're a master teacher? Because you've lived 35 years? No, but because students learn and grow and your colleagues learn and grow from you. And all of that is acknowledged in this legislation in Maryland, and it's being thought about, worked on, and developed across the country. And so I think that we're going to see some real collaboration on behalf of the future of public education from now for the next 5 or 6 years as things really shift.
Yeah, thinking about the state and the role it plays in policy and systems support and structures is really exciting to me. So Robin, let me turn to you. Can you just talk a little bit about KnowledgeWorks' role in this and sort of how you partner on this and how other partners like you could potentially work in the space?
Thanks, Stephanie. I'd love to. Hi, everybody. It's so much fun to be with people and have your minds really on a Tuesday afternoon percolating with all the good stuff going on here. KnowledgeWorks is a nonprofit foundation housed in Cincinnati, and we partner with learning communities, intermediaries all around the country to really hone in on this idea of what does it look like when you have equitable outcomes for all kids. And KnowledgeWorks has done a lot of work around and being a national thought leader in the space of personalized competency-based learning. And we have really taken that to mean if you're going to do personal and deep learning, how does that change the conventional structures? And so there are district conditions in every district office in America, if you will, that talks about curriculum, instruction, the vision, the culture, their assessment programs. What does it look like when we're giving support for kids and having those flexible learning environments? And at KnowledgeWorks, we have several teams, and one of our teams is strategic foresight, and they spend a lot of time and human capital really looking at this idea of the future of learning and understanding that we no longer have a post-World War II model that all of us on the call experienced education with, and the world has changed. And yet, as we've said here, it doesn't feel like school moved into the Jetsons area, right? And so we are trying to really get that happening with systems transformations, building the capacity to do this work with some sustainable efforts. Excuse me. We also have a policy team at KnowledgeWorks that really looks for areas where the policies are favorable, where we have, for instance, in Arizona, you've got waivers on what we mean by seat time. And so how can you begin to leverage some of those to do this transformational work where we totally are challenging? We're going, I love that it's already been said on this call, we're going head to head with this notion that it's one teacher in a one classroom model. And we extend that by saying, and you can no longer have one teacher with one class teaching one lesson, and that every kid is getting the same medicine, if you will, whether they need it or not. to go back to Carol's point on what that looks like when you have that medical team coming in to assess and diagnose and then provide treatment, we're not batching patients. We shouldn't be batching kids anymore either, because we know that the future of learning and what we have totally seen the case for is this idea of customization, and it is deep and meaningful personalization. And so what does that look like when it's happening in classrooms for our kids, and districts are shifting conventional systems to support that change? So at KnowledgeWorks, we have a lot of technical assistance, policy, leadership, strategic foresight, and then the work that I do, which is on the ground in the KnowledgeWorks and schools team, where I get to work with districts like Andy's in Arizona with Mesa and a few others that are really out there on the cutting edge thinking, okay, if we take this idea that school needs to look different, and then you can't just do that in isolation, you have to consider then what does that mean for where I spent a great deal of my career, and that was in front of the classroom. So what does that mean for the teaching role? And lots of teachers that are feeling, I think, really kind of let down and disappointed in the system, if you will, that we've gotten to this place where they still want to do the good work. They believe it's their calling. They want to do what's right by kids. And sometimes it feels like they can't because of the fact that model hasn't changed. And so to be in a position where we're able to kind of inform and influence that a little bit and then provide some technical assistance in the field is what we at KnowledgeWorks do.
So Robin, I want to ask you a question, but after Robin answers, I'd love to hear Jack or Andy, Carol, and you, Michael, jump in on this. You mentioned, so I want to ask about policy. You mentioned the seat time thing. I'm just wondering, and maybe it's too early to tell, but given the work that you've already done on the ground, what policy conditions are you finding that are necessary in order for this to work well?
So what's been interesting about that, and our team has, and again, it's not my wheelhouse where I spend all my time there, but to say what I think we're learning at KnowledgeWorks is there are policies in place in many states across this country that have avenues to do this kind of restructuring, to do some of this kind of flexible thinking within the system that districts aren't aware of. And so they feel like that there's a barrier there when it's really a perceived barrier and it's not an actual. So for instance, the seat time, in Ohio, which is where our home base is, the system is structured around Carnegie units. And so kids are awarded high school credits based on the time they sit in the seat. And that's very much a thing. What do the policies that begin to allow for that flexibility, the policies that begin to allow for credit to be awarded when the learning doesn't necessarily happen in front of me as the licensed teacher, when I can credential learning that may happen outside the walls, those extended learning opportunities, it may be community-based, those mentorships and apprenticeships we talked about. A lot of those policies in place are really helping to begin to kind of clear a path for this change in really the way in which we go about educating kids take some hold.
Carol, Andy, Jack, any thoughts on that, sort of the policy conditions that are necessary or at least beneficial to this?
Well, I just want to really back up what Robin said, and that is actually the actual number of hours for a Carnegie unit. Those have been either eliminated or decreased or given flexibility across many states in the last 10 years. But almost every state still has a 90-day semester for high school students. And so we've changed the rule, but as Robin said, we haven't changed the practice. And so another area is certification, teacher certification. Andy and I could talk about that all day long, how sometimes it's a support, sometimes it's a barrier. And yet we're opening it up to let anyone teach, but we're not saying if you want to become a teacher, here's a very systematic, methodical, smart way to move into it, either through the university or through the school system, like the folks at ASU has designed. Instead, we're just opening up. And so that, I think those are two examples so that we could look at right now.
Another one, Stephanie, is teacher evaluation.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about the impact of a team of educators wrapped around children to meet their needs, but then we go back to evaluating the one teacher as if they're in one classroom. And so we have to think about collective responsibility for higher outputs and satisfaction of our children and our communities.
Which is also about our accountability systems, right? That's
Yes.
another policy piece, right? Because everything is about the one teacher. Can't be that way anymore. Shouldn't have been that way to begin with.
Michael, before I turn, you just wanted to follow up, Andy. Have you guys been able to change the teacher certification or the evaluation to get around these issues, or?
We don't really have issues around teacher certification. It's pretty open here anyway. At least we haven't hit any policy barriers. I think they're more, they're more internal than external in some sense. But I do think that as we are, and it is all, we're seeing all this stuff now about apprenticeships and lots of legislation around opening this up. And I think Jack's right about that. I think that's it's a bit of a slippery slope we're going to have to be careful about. But, as we think about who our teacher candidates are and how they come into the profession, and pathways, it's really about the roles that we create for them in order to come in sooner and take on different levels of responsibility. But they should not be in classrooms by themselves, right? And even, we talk about residency models and putting them with a mentor teacher, and that model, right, has not been sustainable. It's not affordable. We keep going out and trying to get money, right, to support residencies. We have found with our residents, we require in their senior year a full year residency. But now we have paid residencies, but on teams. They're not in a classroom by themselves. And so we can begin to think about our students, even from their freshman year, that begin to take on different roles, right? Let's say by the time they get to their, they're moving from their sophomore year to the junior year, is there something called an associate teacher? Right? Can we stop talking about paraprofessionals? Can we talk about assistant teachers, associate teachers that have different roles to play, different job descriptions? We've been talking, we're building a platform called Community Educators, where we really are trying to figure out, as a college, we have never been able to liberate our content, or we have never liberated, let me say, not that we have not been able to. But we haven't done it. If you want to come and you want to learn something about how to teach, you have to come take a credit-bearing 3-credit-hour course. And so now we're saying, how do we take all of that? How do we modularize it? How do we break that down for people in the community, provide them with 20-minute sort of increments? We're building what we call backpacks, bundles and backpacks, so that it's an hour, it's 2 hours, right, of learning how to teach kids to read. But then you go into a school and you're not a tutor, you're a reading accelerator. You're now able to work with a small group of kids, but you're on a team, right? And this could be people that are volunteers, but they could be part-time, paid and all those kinds of things. But we are, back to your question about, we have to make this cost neutral. If we don't make this cost neutral, we can't do this. So everything that we're doing is just trying to create as many different roles as we possibly can for people, so that districts can start to think about this in different ways and start to build the right kinds of roles, the right kinds of adults with the right kinds of credentials around kids. But it doesn't mean that it's more people or less people, or, it's just a different configuration of people. So we've got lots of models, lots of ways of thinking. All of this is on our website. You too can go to Next Education Workforce at ASU and see all kinds of things and school spotlights and different models and different configurations of the way this is beginning to look. And we're agnostic about the model. We just believe it's got to be about a group of kids and a group of adults around those kids. It's not a one teacher, one classroom model, and it is not about PLCs after school. These are real teams working in real time in a dynamic way around kids. But how you do that and who they are and all of that, we're agnostic about that.
Stephanie, if I could just give a 30-second response to Carol. I think Carol's spot on. And if you look at Arizona, they don't have the same level of challenges around certification, because as you said earlier, it's so contextual across 50 states. You have states that have reciprocity with lots of other states. You have states that have no reciprocity whatsoever. You have states that will let someone who has just a bachelor's degree walk in and be the teacher of record on the first day and be in that room with no support, none of this. And so I really think the secret to this is to build these systems that we're talking about today, and then have the certification follow in the state so that it either enhances, removes barriers, changes, stays the same, whatever needs to happen in that state. And then those school systems are going to have to do exactly the same thing with their own practices and policies.
Helpful. Thanks, Jack. Well, Michael has been quietly, silently waiting. So thank you, Michael. Sorry it took me so long to get to you. So you guys have been engaged in this sort of the educator workforce for a while. Just talk a little bit about sort of how you guys approach it.
Sure. And I was happy to just sit and listen. I would have been fine if we ran out of time. I'm learning so much by being part of this. So thank you very much. Just briefly, the Thornburg Foundation, we're located in Santa Fe. We're a small family foundation, and our focus is really on influencing policy at the state level. And in K-12, that's a pretty daunting task. As a funder, I'm aware of how tiny our paddle is compared with the ship that we're trying to influence. New Mexico just passed its fiscal year 23 budget. For education, it's $3.8 billion, which for most states doesn't sound like very much. For us, that's actually a 44% increase over the last 5 years. So we've seen education funding increasing substantially. I tried to calculate our grant making as a percentage of that state budget, and I mean, the decimals really confused me. If I round, we are 0.03% of the state budget, our grant making. So that's why I say it's a tiny paddle. We have to be pretty strategic. And the other thing I'm aware of is that this really involves higher education and colleges of education. And again, our grant making, it just doesn't go that far. So we've been very strategic about those points of leverage, how we can add value, and specifically around this topic of teacher preparation. And I would throw leadership preparation in as well. We've tried to do a few things that we think are worthwhile. One is to fund technical assistance. So the state is throwing money at this larger workforce challenge. We want to make sure that colleges of education are well prepared, have the capacity to be thoughtful about how they spend those funds. So we've made a grant to Prepared to Teach at Bank Street College to come in and work with colleges of education, specifically around how to stand up residency models that Carol referred to. And I think that this question around staffing fits right in, the idea that it doesn't need to be just one resident with one master teacher. It could be a team approach. The second is research and evaluation. We're able to provide data that shows the efficacy of these approaches. So right now, we're working with the National Center on Teacher Residencies to look at one model within Albuquerque that is a partnership between the public schools, the UNM College of Education, and the teachers union. So just to come back to that issue of where are the unions, I think it's fantastic. They're actually our grantee on the project, and then they're contracting out for the work. That relates to the third type of funding that we're able to do, which is around advocacy. So we're very deliberate about identifying the teachers union as that grantee, because on the back end of the project, they're well positioned to do both the advocacy as well as the lobbying. We don't fund the lobbying, but they have the capacity through their organization to do that. And then finally, I mentioned capacity building, but we're working with an organization called Golden Apple in New Mexico, and it's specifically around this recruitment piece, because it's one thing to say, we're going to put a whole bunch of money toward teacher preparation, but if we don't attract the applicants, it's sort of if you build it, they will come, might not really be true unless we do some work to get them there as well. So those are some ways that we think as funders, we can chip in and add value, even with all the public funding that's going in.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And we fund a lot of those same things. I want to make sure I leave 5 minutes at the end for all the other panelists to answer these questions about how funders can best engage. But let me just pull a question out of the chat here, which is, how does this approach help with the need to diversify the teaching profession? We've seen all the research. There's a lot of funder activity in the space, a lot of policy work in the space. Just curious your thoughts on this approach and whether or not it helps diversify the workforce, or if not, how can we make sure that it does?
So there is a lot here around equity in general, frankly, both for kids and for teachers. And I think, in some ways what we're trying to do here is we're trying to build a better mousetrap. We're trying to do two things. One is, and two things that we learned from the pandemic, right? Everybody wants flexibility today and nobody wants to be isolated. And teaching right now is both inflexible and isolating. So I think if we are ever going to get to a point where we can attract more people, and particularly a diverse population of people to the workforce, we're going to have to think very differently about what this is, and really think about the fact of how inflexible and how isolating the job of teaching is, right? If I have to go deal with my kid, I have a doctor's appointment, I have whatever I have, you can't leave today, right? And then we struggle with trying to find subs, and we try, like, there's all kinds of things, right, that start to change the minute that we start to change this. In talking to folks at the unions have been trying to think about, how to actually negotiate around working condition, and with the belief, right, that if we can change working condition and we can change the way that schools look and what they look like, that we may be able, right, to now attract a different group of people. We might be able to diversify on a number of different things. It's still going to take, we're going to have to pay teachers more, or there's no question. This does not address that. We can't do that, but I think we're still going to have to address those issues. But we also think, right, that if kids have a team, they are also more likely to have someone who looks like them, right? Because that's here's your 30 kids, your 30 kids, and your 30 kids. If one of those teachers is a person of color, only those 30 kids are going to have that particular teacher. So this is also a way, right, to start thinking about that and think about other people who are coming in, how we bring in the community into the profession, how we place them on teams, the roles that we give them. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here that as we rebuild the teaching workforce, I think that's an opportunity for us to be able to think differently about how we're going to diversify. Because again, that's been a lot of programs and projects and activities on a very small scale. And we haven't cracked that either.
Anyone else on the diversity question?
Stephanie, I'd like to share a thought. When we think about the No Child Left Behind era of education in 2001, the children that went through that curriculum should now be teaching in classrooms, and they're not. So we have to look back and think about the learning environments and experiences that we create in classrooms today is our next education and generation of our teaching workforce. So when our students are placed into teams and they learn differently, they feel differently, and they are connected in new and different ways, my prediction is that they are going to be more likely to choose teaching as their profession. And we are intentionally creating more pathways for them to be able to do that. For many years, it was a select chosen group of people that became teachers. You like school, you do well in school, you become a teacher. And so we have to think about how we build multiple pathways into the profession of teaching. But I continue to confirm my belief that when children love their learning environments, they're more likely to become teachers. And so we have to start that the minute that they walk into our kindergarten and preschool classrooms.
And I have one additional thought about this, Stephanie. Going to college when you graduate from high school is correlated directly in the United States of America to income and to your parents' educational level. So we know by far the highest percentage of people in this country who go to college, which is right now the primary entry to the teaching profession, are white, middle, and upper class individuals. So providing a different way for people to enter the profession, like, I say this every once in a while, I'm kind of a miracle. My parents didn't go to high school, let alone graduate. We had a very low income in my family. A lot of the research says I had an 8% chance of getting to go to college. So all the people I knew who were around me, none of them went to college. Didn't matter their race, their background. But we also know that many times our African-American students, our Latino students, and many of our white students don't go to college because of income or because of family education level. So if you can go in and be a paraprofessional 30 years, that's a great contribution to a school system. But what if you could go in and be a teaching assistant and someone's paying your tuition to go to college? You have models of other teachers around you, new to the profession, co-teachers who've been in 10 years and master teachers who've been in 30 years or 40 years. And that's the environment you grow up in as a professional. That's a way to draw people in who aren't part of the pool right now so often when we're trying to hire teachers. And we were actually doing this in my last school system. And we thought of our 3,000 paraprofessionals, we could move several hundred of them a year once we got going through that system. And we were getting it done before COVID. And I'm praying that it will continue this year and into the future. But it's very regional, very local. We've got to do it all the time, everywhere, if we're going to affect 100,000 plus schools.
Great. It's not exactly a question, but I think I'm going to try to make a question out of this, which has to do with potential for parent pushback. So certainly during COVID, we have seen a lot of parent engagement in schools, in school board meetings in schools, both for the good and for the bad, if I have to be honest here. And just curious experience, I don't know, Andy, Carol, Robin, I'm not sure, have you seen any parent pushback on sort of these, on sort of what could be considered dramatic change? And if so, how do you sort of prep parents for what might be coming?
I can just start real quickly to talk about the teaming model. We launched also during COVID, the Mesa Parent Council, and meeting with one parent per school 4 times a year. And the one thing when I always open up the end for truth and rumor, what do you want to know? You know, is Facebook real? Like, let's just talk. And so they asked, one parent asked, what can I do to ensure that all grade levels at our school are working within that teaming model? This is the first time that my child has really felt like she is understood. And so there are conversations that are happening about more. The other is that many of our families have been very disgruntled with school closures and with staffing shortages. In our schools that are fully embracing the teaming model, they don't feel any bumps in the road because of a staffing shortage. They come together to rally around children. And so they do what it takes to make sense of the children, and these children know all of these teachers. So when we think about what our families want most, is that loving, caring adult in their child's life. If we can continue to provide that more often than not, parent satisfaction blooms. Now, I'm sure that there will be pushback as we get larger, but I'll loop back with you when I hear it. But for now, we're all good.
Yeah, well, you're right. Is when something is successful, success breeds success. I think you said that.
Yes.
So, and I want to ask just sort of a final question on how funders can engage. But if there's anybody else that wanted to jump in on the parent question, I don't want to cut anybody.
I would just say, Stephanie, that I echo what Andy has seen in communities and districts that are kind of getting out in front of it and have an engagement, a rich engagement kind of experience for parents, and bringing them in and not just paying lip service, but really doing authentic listening, feedback, and where they kind of co-construct some things together. There's some job satisfaction, if you will, for the parents as well in that experience, and they're less suspicious when we go to make some of these shifts in traditional systems. And I think it boils down to exactly what you said. If I send my kid to school and my kid comes home and they're happy, then I'm happy, and I'm less likely to march up to school with issues. I may have questions. I certainly want to understand, but the whole tone of those conversations are different, and we can kind of learn together and construct that. So I think there's something to be said for that. Andy, you've hit it.
Well, we only have a couple minutes left here, and maybe just if we wouldn't mind, we could go around the horn. And, you know, one thing that when I used to be a reporter, we would always make sure that all the panelists said, don't get off the phone without giving us at least 3 story ideas. So I'm going to turn that question and just say, I would love to hear from all of you guys. You know, Michael already laid out like a lot of really great funding ideas. How do you think funders can engage? Like from your vantage point, what is the best way funders can engage in this? And I'll start, I don't know, Jack, do you feel comfortable with me kicking it to you first?
Sure. I can't say how much I appreciate the funders and all they do for public education, truly, as a public educator for many years. And I think one of the most valuable things they can do is come together and work as that kind of outside objective partner when you're working with the associations, when you're working with the administrators and the teachers and everyone, with the politicians, and creating structures to review those policies, procedures, practices in your school system, in your state, and say, let's evaluate this and let's see what's happening. And then also being champions, because the folks at the General Assembly or the legislature, they listen to our foundations. They do. They know that foundations are trying to do the best, clear, purposeful work, and they listen to them as outside objective observers of all this. So I think in both those ways, funders can be great.
Great. Robin?
I think it's a great opportunity for funders to highlight or amplify or uplift some of the exemplars in this work. So if there's a way to kind of do some outreach into the field to see where it's happening, where all systems are go, and then kind of tell that story and maybe help fund some of that storytelling. You're also contributing to the evidence base, because one of the things that the skeptic in all of us asks is, yeah, but how do we know this works? How is this going to work? And if especially we don't, you may not always have, I don't know what the hard data would mean, but there's data in the stories. And so taking an opportunity to perhaps looking for ways to fund that, I think would be great.
Great. Andy?
I would love for funders to continue to push us further and take us higher than we ever thought that we could go before. Put the challenges before us and we can get there. Help us. Oftentimes we have the ideas, we just don't have access to the resources. So if you give us the challenge, give us some resources to get there and work side by side with us, we will continue to show you really great stuff.
I want to say if I could build a cloning machine, I would clone Andy. That would be my first funder move. Carol.
Oh my, look, I think I would love to see the funder community come together around this. I think we need a national effort. There is a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of levers to be pressed around how we prepare teachers, how we're placing them, how we're working with schools, how we ramp this up, and how we do this nationally. We have folks from South Carolina, St. Louis, Boston coming this week. We have about 100 schools coming next month to learn more about this. The word is out, and we have got to figure out how we're going to scale this. We do not have all the answers. I agree with Andy. We need some thought partners in this, but we're also going to need resources to figure out how to build this as a national effort. This cannot sit in a few schools, even Andy's 50. It's going to have to move if we're going to move this whole education system. And I'm just convinced that we got to break this one teacher, one classroom model. So.
Well, I take that challenge. I want to thank all the panelists. I mean, it was brilliant. Really lucky to have you guys hearing you guys today. Olga, I guess I turn it back to you.
Yes, just want to echo that. Thank you, Stephanie, for moderating a great conversation. And thank you to our panelists for everything you're doing and are going to change for young people. For those watching, the video of this is going to be available in 1 week if you want to go back and kind of get what you might have missed in this conversation. And then we've got some upcoming programs on March 8th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We have Becky Pringle from the National Education Association and Randy Weingarten from the American Federation of Teachers coming to kind of talk about the opportunities of this moment. So we will make sure to make some notes and explore this for sure. On March 21st at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, we have Shifting Power in Grant Making, which is the first in a series. It's really talking about equitable grant making in education and what it means for us to learn from each other in doing that work. So thank you again for joining us and have a great rest of your day.